"Your voice is annoying, Margaret. Go eat in your room." Those were the words my daughter-in-law chose to say to me in the middle of dinner, as casually as if she were asking someone to pass the mashed potatoes. I looked up from my plate and waited for my son to laugh awkwardly and tell her she'd gone too far. Ethan had always been a good boy once. The kind who cried when a bird fell from its nest and insisted on carrying my grocery bags even after he'd grown taller than me. But at 41 years old, my son kept his eyes fixed on his pot roast. He cut another bite with careful precision, lifted it to his mouth, and said nothing. The silence around that dining table was louder than Brittany's insult. I could hear the ticking of the clock in the hallway, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the clink of Lily's fork against her plate before my granddaughter froze, her wide blue eyes darting between her parents and me. Brittany dabbed the corners of her mouth with a linen napkin and smiled as if she'd simply corrected a child with poor manners. "You talk too much during dinner," she added. "Honestly, it's exhausting. Why don't you eat upstairs? It'll be more peaceful for everyone." For a moment, I stared at the steam rising from my green beans. I'd spent nearly 2 hours preparing that meal. The roast had been seasoned the way Ethan liked since high school. The homemade rolls were Lily's favorite. I'd even made Brittany's preferred cranberry salad, despite the fact she'd once joked that people my age had too much free time on their hands. I had set the table with the good dishes because family dinners mattered to me. They always had. After my husband Thomas passed away 3 years earlier, those dinners became the one tradition I clung to. They reminded me that although grief had taken my partner of 45 years, I still had a family. Or at least, I thought I did. I slowly placed my fork beside my plate and folded my napkin. I noticed Lily shifting in her seat, her cheeks turning pink. Ethan finally glanced in my direction, but there was no outrage in his expression, only discomfort, the kind that made people look away instead of doing the right thing. "Mom," he said quietly, not quite meeting my eyes, "maybe just for tonight. Just for tonight." Funny how those words have a way of stretching into months, into years, into entire relationships reshaped by small acts of surrender. I stood carefully, aware of the stiffness in my knees that always flared before rainstorms. "Of course," I said softly. "I wouldn't want to ruin dinner." Brittany let out a breath that sounded suspiciously like relief. I picked up my plate and glass of iced tea. The stairs suddenly felt steeper than they had that morning. One hand steadied the railing while the other balanced the meal I'd cooked, but was no longer welcome to share. Halfway up the staircase, I paused when I heard Brittany's voice drift upward from the dining room below. It was low enough that she probably thought I couldn't hear it. "It won't matter much longer anyway," she said. The room downstairs went quiet for a heartbeat. Then came the nervous scrape of Ethan's chair against the hardwood floor. I stood perfectly still on the staircase, my fingers tightening around the edge of the plate as my pulse quickened. I didn't know exactly what she meant by those words, but for the first time in a very long while, I realized my humiliation that night wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. I carried my dinner the rest of the way upstairs with steady hands, although my thoughts were anything but steady. By the time I reached my bedroom, the mashed potatoes had begun to cool and the iced tea no longer clinked cheerfully against the glass. I closed the door quietly behind me and set the plate down on the small oak writing desk near the window. The room smelled faintly of lavender and old books. It had been my sanctuary long before Ethan married Brittany, back when Thomas would sit in the armchair by the fireplace reading mystery novels aloud whenever rain tapped against the roof. I lowered myself onto the edge of the bed and listened. Even through the floorboards, I could hear laughter drifting up from downstairs. Silverware scraped against china. Someone turned on the television in the family room. Life continued without interruption, as though I had simply stepped out for a moment instead of being dismissed from my own dinner table. I picked up my fork and forced myself to eat a few bites. The roast was tender. The carrots had been cooked exactly the way Thomas had loved them, soft enough to melt in your mouth. For years, he used to tease me that I could turn an ordinary Tuesday dinner into Thanksgiving. Family mattered to him. Respect mattered to him. I glanced toward the framed photograph on my nightstand. Thomas stood beside me in front of our first home, his arm wrapped around my shoulders, both of us squinting into the summer sun. We had been 24 years old. We had barely enough money to buy groceries, but we had dreams bigger than our checking account. We worked double shifts, saved every extra dollar. painted walls ourselves because hiring professionals was a luxury we could not afford. When Ethan was born, Thomas built the nursery with his own hands. Every crooked shelf and uneven coat of paint became part of our story. We used to whisper to each other late at night about the kind of man we hoped our son would become. Kind, honest, loyal. The kind of husband who protected his family instead of hiding behind silence. I swallowed hard and set my fork down. Somewhere along the way, that version of Ethan had disappeared so gradually that I had convinced myself I was imagining it. Brittany interrupting me whenever I spoke during holidays. Ethan insisting she was just stressed. Brittany changing recipes because my cooking was outdated. Ethan laughing awkwardly and asking me not to take it personally. Brittany rearranging the kitchen cabinets without asking because my system made no sense. Ethan shrugging his shoulders and saying it was easier this way. Small moments. Tiny cuts. None of them serious enough to protest. Not individually. But over time, they had stitched together into something I could no longer ignore. I stared down at my untouched dinner and wondered when accommodation had become expectation. When compromise had become surrender. When being considerate had turned into making myself smaller so other people could remain comfortable. My eyes drifted back toward the photograph of Thomas. I remembered his voice clearly. You never have to earn your place in your own family, Margaret. Love is not permission that someone grants you when you are convenient. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. I quickly wiped beneath my eyes even though I had not cried. The door opened a few inches before a familiar face peeked through. Lily stood there clutching a small plate with 2 chocolate chip cookies balanced carefully in her hands. Her expression held none of the discomfort adults mastered so easily. Only concern. Grandma, she whispered, stepping into the room. Are you okay? I looked at my 12-year-old granddaughter standing in the doorway, and for the first time that evening, I had the unmistakable feeling that someone else in this house had noticed exactly what had happened downstairs. I forced a small smile and patted the empty space beside me on the bed. Lily closed the door behind her with the cautious seriousness of someone carrying an important secret. She set the plate of cookies on the desk next to my untouched dinner and climbed onto the quilt Thomas had bought during our trip to Vermont almost 20 years earlier. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. She twisted the hem of her sweatshirt around her fingers and stared down at her sneakers. At 12 years old, Lily was old enough to understand more than adults often realized and young enough to still be troubled by unfairness. Finally, she looked up at me. Grandma, I do not think what Mom said downstairs was nice. I let out a quiet breath. No, sweetheart, I said gently. It was not very kind. Lily frowned. Dad should have said something. Children had a way of placing truth on the table without decorating it with excuses. I glanced toward the family photograph on my nightstand, the one taken the summer Lily turned 6. Ethan had his arm around Brittany, while Lily sat on Thomas's shoulders, both of them laughing at something outside the camera frame. Looking at that picture now felt strange, as though I were remembering people I used to know instead of the family living downstairs. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, I replied carefully. Lily's expression remained troubled. But this keeps happening. The words settled heavily between us. I turned back to her slowly. What do you mean? She hesitated, then lowered her voice. Mom gets upset whenever you talk too much at dinner. She says you always tell the same stories. Last month, when you were helping me with my science project, she said you should let other people have a chance to shine. And when you wanted to decorate for Thanksgiving, she told Dad that you make everything about yourself. Each sentence landed with quiet precision. None of them sounded dramatic on their own. They sounded ordinary, harmless, even, but placed side by side. They formed a picture I could no longer pretend not to see. Lily looked down at her hands. I thought maybe she was just having bad days. I remembered all the moments I had explained away. Brittany insisting that my living room furniture arrangement felt old-fashioned. Brittany laughing that older people always worried too much. Brittany reminding Ethan that boundaries were healthy whenever I offered help. Ethan apologizing for her. Ethan asking me not to take things personally. Ethan encouraging patience because family was complicated. I had accepted every explanation because acknowledging the alternative felt unbearable. Lily reached for one of the cookies and broke it in half. Grandma, she asked softly, can I tell you something if you promise not to be mad? My stomach tightened. Of course. She looked toward the closed bedroom door before speaking. I heard Mom and Dad talking yesterday. Her voice became almost a whisper. Mom said that you would be happier somewhere else. She said this house has to work for their future and that everything would be easier once they stopped feeling guilty. The room seemed to grow very still around me. Outside the bedroom window, a passing car moved down the quiet suburban street. Somewhere downstairs, laughter drifted faintly through the floorboards. I folded my hands together in my lap to hide the slight tremor in my fingers. Did your father say anything? I asked. Lily nodded slowly. He asked if they were doing the right thing. She swallowed hard before continuing. Mom said that if they waited too long, they would miss their chance. I stared at the fading sunlight stretching across the bedroom carpet and thought back to Brittany's words on the staircase. It will not matter much longer anyway. At the time, I had dismissed them as another unkind remark. But now, sitting beside my granddaughter with half of a chocolate chip cookie untouched in her hand, I realized those words had not been careless at all. They had been part of a plan. And for the first time since Thomas died, I had the unmistakable feeling that something much larger than one humiliating dinner was unfolding beneath the roof of the home we had spent a lifetime building. After Lily returned downstairs, I remained seated on the edge of my bed long after the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times. The untouched cookie rested beside my cold dinner while dusk settled outside the bedroom window, casting long shadows across the familiar room. I looked around at the life Thomas and I had built together. The cream-colored curtains we picked out after arguing over floral prints versus simple patterns. The cedar chest at the foot of the bed that held baby blankets, birthday cards, and ticket stubs from concerts we had attended decades ago. The bookshelf filled with cookbooks, mystery novels, and photo albums documenting birthdays, graduations, and Christmas mornings. Every object carried a memory. Every memory carried Thomas. I stood and walked toward the closet, reaching automatically for the small wooden box tucked safely on the highest shelf. Thomas had given it to me on our 40th wedding anniversary. Inside were handwritten notes, old photographs, and small reminders of a life shared with intention. I sat back down and opened it carefully. The first thing I saw was a faded photograph of Ethan at age 7, grinning proudly beside the bicycle Thomas had saved for months to buy him. I remembered the second job Thomas took stocking shelves overnight because he refused to disappoint our son. There had been years when money was tight enough that we split restaurant meals and postponed vacations, but Ethan never felt the weight of our sacrifices. We wanted him to grow up secure, loved, and confident that home was a place where he belonged. I traced my fingers across another photograph, this one from Ethan's college graduation. Thomas had cried that day. He tried to hide it by pretending the spring pollen had irritated his eyes, but I knew better. We had sat together in the bleachers, holding hands while cheering louder than anyone else in the crowd. On the drive home, Thomas squeezed my hand and said, "We did it, Maggie. We raised a good man." I closed my eyes and listened to the echo of his voice. For years after Ethan married Brittany, whenever I noticed small changes in our family dynamic, Thomas reassured me. He reminded me that marriages required adjustment and that becoming in-laws came with growing pains. He encouraged patience. He believed that love and consistency would smooth over misunderstandings. Even during his illness, when hospital visits and medications consumed our days, he never stopped assuming the best about people. Then I found the note tucked beneath the stack of anniversary cards. The handwriting was unmistakably Thomas's, neat and steady despite the arthritis that had begun affecting his fingers during his final years. I unfolded it carefully. It was not dramatic or alarming. That had never been Thomas's way. The note simply read, "Maggie, if there ever comes a day when you begin doubting your worth in this family, remember this. You built this home beside me. You earned your place at every table where love is served. Never allow loneliness to convince you that respect is something you must beg for. The people who truly love you will never ask you to disappear for their convenience." Tears blurred my vision for the first time that evening. Not because of Brittany's words or Ethan's silence, but because Thomas had understood something I had forgotten. Grief had made me accommodating. Fear of losing what remained of my family had made me quieter. I had mistaken endurance for peacekeeping. Downstairs, I heard the front door open and close, followed by Brittany's laughter drifting faintly upward. Life in the house moved forward as usual, yet something inside me had shifted. Lily's innocent confession and Thomas's. handwritten reminder had combined into a truth I could no longer ignore. Whatever Brittany meant by saying it would not matter much longer, whatever plans had been unfolding beneath my roof, I knew one thing with certainty. I would not spend the rest of my life apologizing for taking up space in the home my husband and I had spent 45 years creating together. I barely slept that night. Long after the house had gone quiet, I lay awake staring at the ceiling while Thomas's note rested on my nightstand beneath the glow of the reading lamp. The words replayed in my mind with a clarity that left no room for excuses. Respect is not something you beg for. By 6:30 the next morning, habit pulled me from bed. I wrapped my cardigan around my shoulders and made my way downstairs, expecting the familiar comfort of routine to settle my thoughts. Instead, I found myself paying attention in a way I had not before. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and lemon-scented cleaner. Brittany stood at the counter scrolling through her phone while packing Lily's lunch. Ethan sat at the island, reading emails on his tablet between sips of coffee. Neither of them acknowledged me at first. I moved quietly toward the cabinet to retrieve my favorite mug, only to stop short when I realized it was gone. The entire cabinet had been reorganized. The mugs Thomas and I had collected during our travels had disappeared from their usual shelf. My hand hovered uncertainly before Brittany glanced up. "Oh," she said casually, "I moved some things around." The old setup was inefficient. Old setup. The phrase settled heavily in my chest. Not your kitchen. Not our family traditions. Just old. Ethan barely looked up. "It does work better this way, Mom." I nodded and chose a plain white mug from the lower shelf. A small adjustment. Another tiny surrender. Lily shuffled into the kitchen a few minutes later, offering me a quick hug before taking her seat. Her eyes met mine briefly, carrying the secret weight of our conversation from the night before. Brittany handed her a lunch bag and checked the time. "Do not forget," she said to Ethan. "We have the appointment Thursday afternoon." Ethan stiffened slightly. "Right?" he answered, keeping his attention fixed on the tablet in front of him. "Appointment." My fingers tightened around the coffee mug. I stirred in cream I did not want and pretended not to notice the sudden tension that settled over the room. "What appointment?" I asked lightly. Brittany smiled without warmth. "Just errands. Nothing exciting." Then she changed the subject so quickly it almost felt rehearsed. Lily glanced down at her cereal bowl. Ethan cleared his throat and asked about the weather forecast. The conversation moved forward while I remained standing at the edge of it, invisible and included all at once. Later that morning, after Lily left for school and Ethan headed to the office, Brittany gathered her purse from the hallway table. "I may be out for a while," she said. "Do not wait up if I am late." She paused before adding, "You know, Margaret, there are some wonderful communities for people in different stages of life these days. Places with activities and friends your own age. People seem much happier there." The words were delivered with practiced sweetness, concern disguised as kindness. Before I could respond, she smiled politely and closed the front door behind her. The silence that followed pressed against my ears. I carried my coffee into the family room and lowered myself into Thomas's recliner. From there, I could see the framed photographs lining the mantel. Birthdays, school plays, Christmas mornings. Evidence of a family that had once seemed unshakable. My gaze drifted toward the hallway table where Brittany had left a folded brochure partially tucked beneath a stack of mail. I rose slowly and picked it up. Across the front, printed in elegant blue lettering above a photograph of smiling seniors playing cards, were the words, "Willow Creek Senior Living." I stared at the brochure while my heartbeat echoed steadily in my ears. Suddenly, Lily's confession, Brittany's comment on the staircase, and the mysterious appointment no longer felt like disconnected moments. They were pieces of the same puzzle. And standing alone in the quiet house Thomas and I had built together, I understood with chilling certainty that someone had already begun making plans for the next chapter of my life without ever asking whether I wanted to turn the page. I stood in the middle of the family room holding the Willow Creek brochure while sunlight filtered through the bay windows Thomas had insisted on installing because he loved natural light. The smiling faces printed across the glossy paper stared back at me with carefully crafted reassurance. Elegant dining, daily activities, comfortable living. It looked pleasant enough if it had been my choice. But choice was the detail that caught in my throat. I folded the brochure neatly and returned it to the hallway table exactly where I had found it. Then I did something I had not done in years. I stopped reacting and started paying attention. The rest of the morning passed quietly. I watered the hydrangeas along the front walkway, folded laundry, and organized the pantry shelves. To anyone looking in from the outside, I was simply an older woman going about her routine. Inside, however, every conversation from the past 24 hours replayed with new meaning. Brittany's remark on the staircase. Lily's whispered confession. The mysterious appointment. The brochure. One coincidence could be dismissed. For could not. Around noon, I prepared myself a simple lunch and sat at the kitchen table where Thomas and I had once balanced checkbooks while discussing vacation plans and college tuition payments. The house felt different now, not because the walls had changed, but because my understanding of what was happening inside them had. I glanced toward the calendar hanging beside the refrigerator. Thursday afternoon. Appointment. Without thinking, I reached for my phone and opened the family shared calendar Brittany had encouraged everyone to use years earlier to coordinate schedules. Most entries were ordinary. Lily's soccer practice, Ethan's meetings, school events. Then I noticed an item listed for Thursday at 2 o'clock. WC consultation. No additional details. No explanation. I stared at the screen while a chill settled over me despite the warm spring air drifting through the open window. Consultation. Not a casual visit. Not an information session. A consultation. My gaze shifted toward the framed family photograph on the counter. Ethan had been 32 when that picture was taken. He had wrapped one arm around Brittany and the other around me, smiling broadly into the camera. "You are the two most important women in my life," he had said that day. I wondered when fear of conflict had replaced courage, when silence had become easier than honesty. The sound of tires crunching against the driveway interrupted my thoughts. Brittany returned carrying several shopping bags and speaking into her phone. She did not notice me immediately. "Yes," she said with an easy laugh. "It is probably for the best. She will adjust eventually." She stepped into the foyer and caught sight of me standing near the kitchen entrance. Without missing a beat, her expression softened into polite concern. "Margaret, I did not realize you were there." I smiled faintly. "Just making lunch." She slipped her phone into her purse. "Good. By the way, Ethan and I might need to discuss some future planning soon. We all have to make practical decisions as families grow and circumstances change." Practical decisions. The phrase echoed through me. "Of course," I replied calmly. "Practical decisions should involve everyone affected by them." Something flickered briefly across her face before disappearing behind another practiced smile. "Naturally," she said. Then she carried her shopping bags upstairs. I remained where I was long after her footsteps faded. The Margaret of 6 months earlier might have accepted vague reassurances and waited patiently for clarity that never arrived. The woman standing in Thomas's kitchen now understood something different. People rarely announce betrayal dramatically. More often, it arrives through softened language and gentle smiles, through conversations held behind closed doors, through decisions disguised as concern. I looked once more at Thursday's appointment on the calendar and closed the application carefully. Whatever consultation Ethan and Brittany had scheduled, whatever future they had begun arranging without me, they had made one critical mistake. They assumed I would remain the quiet woman, carrying her dinner upstairs without asking questions. And for the first time in a very long while, I intended to prove them wrong. Thursday arrived wrapped in the ordinary routines that had once defined safety for me. I made coffee before sunrise, packed Lily's lunch while Brittany rushed through her morning schedule, and listened as Ethan discussed deadlines over breakfast without meeting my eyes for more than a few seconds at a time. If either of them noticed the change in me, they did not mention it. I no longer filled silences with reassurance or offered explanations on their behalf. Instead, I observed. I noticed how Brittany checked the clock every few minutes. I noticed how Ethan rubbed the back of his neck whenever she referenced their afternoon plans. I noticed how Lily looked at me across the table with quiet concern before climbing onto the school bus. By 10 o'clock, the house had emptied. I stood in the foyer beneath the framed wedding portrait Thomas and I had displayed for decades and reached for my handbag. There was one person I trusted to tell me the truth without softening it to preserve my feelings. Harold Benson had been Thomas's attorney and friend for more than 30 years. He had drafted our wills, guided us through estate planning, and attended every holiday gathering where Thomas insisted on grilling hamburgers despite snow flurries. Harold valued preparation over panic. He respected facts more than assumptions. The receptionist recognized my voice immediately when I called. "Mrs. Collins, Mr. Benson has an opening this morning if you can come in." 45 minutes later, I found myself seated in Harold's office surrounded by shelves lined with leather-bound legal volumes and family photographs of grandchildren holding fishing poles. Harold removed his reading glasses and studied me carefully. "Margaret," he said gently, "you look like someone carrying a question she does not want answered." I folded my hands together to stop their trembling. "I think my family is making plans for my future without including me," I admitted. "I need to understand exactly where I stand." Harold listened without interruption as I described the brochure, the consultation, Lily's concerns, and the growing realization that concern and control often wore similar faces. When I finished speaking, he leaned back thoughtfully before opening the file cabinet beside his desk. "Thomas believed in preparing for possibilities most people preferred not to discuss," he said. He retrieved a thick folder and placed it carefully on the desk between us. "Your husband updated several documents during his final year." My heart tightened at the mention of Thomas. Harold opened the folder and turned several pages toward me. "Margaret, this home was structured very intentionally. Thomas wanted to ensure you remained protected regardless of future circumstances. The ownership arrangements, beneficiary designations, and decision-making authority were established with considerable care." I stared at the paperwork while relief and disbelief tangled together inside me. "Protected?" I whispered. Harold nodded. "You have significantly more authority than I suspect anyone realizes. No one can simply decide what happens to your residence or future without your participation." I closed my eyes briefly as Thomas's note echoed through my thoughts. "Never allow loneliness to convince you that respect is something you must beg for." Harold's voice softened. "You do not have to make any decisions today, but I would encourage you to stop assuming everyone understands the legal and practical realities involved." I looked down at the documents resting beneath my fingertips. For the first time in days, my breathing steadied. The fear that had settled heavily across my shoulders began giving way to something quieter and stronger. Clarity. By the time I left Harold's office that afternoon, the spring sunshine felt different against my skin. Ethan and Brittany might have been planning consultations and discussing futures they believed were inevitable. They might have mistaken my silence for surrender and my grief for helplessness. But as I placed the folder carefully inside my handbag and walked toward my car, I understood one thing with absolute certainty. The woman they thought they knew no longer existed. And the conversation waiting at the end of this day would not unfold the way they expected. When I returned home that evening, the house looked exactly as it always had. The white shutters Thomas painted every spring framed the front windows. The wind chimes hanging near the porch swayed gently in the breeze. Somewhere down the street, a lawn mower hummed beneath the fading afternoon sun. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. I placed my handbag on the foyer table and paused beneath the wedding portrait that had greeted guests for decades. Thomas's smile seemed almost knowing now. I touched the frame lightly before heading into the kitchen. "Grandma," Lily called the moment she spotted me. She hurried over and wrapped her arms around my waist. "How was your day?" I brushed a strand of hair behind her ear and smiled. "Productive," I said simply. It was the truth. Brittany appeared moments later carrying a grocery bag filled with ingredients for dinner. "You are back later than usual," she remarked. "I had a few things to take care of," I replied. Her eyes lingered on me for a moment as though searching for something unusual, but she quickly returned to unpacking vegetables onto the counter. Ethan arrived shortly afterward, loosening his tie as he stepped through the front door. He looked tired, older than his 41 years. "Everything okay?" he asked absent-mindedly. "Everything is fine," I answered. The evening unfolded with an almost theatrical normalcy. I helped Lily with her math homework while Brittany prepared salad. Ethan answered work emails at the kitchen island. The television murmured quietly from the family room. Anyone witnessing it would have described us as an ordinary American family sharing an ordinary Thursday evening. But beneath the surface, I carried knowledge they did not realize I possessed. When dinner was finally served, Brittany arranged plates around the table with practiced efficiency. Lily took her usual seat. Ethan settled beside her. I lowered myself into my chair, smoothing my napkin across my lap. For a few blessed minutes, conversation remained harmless. Lily described a science experiment involving baking soda volcanoes. Ethan commented on traffic. Brittany discussed rising grocery prices. Then I reached for the bread basket and began telling Lily about the first cake Thomas and I attempted to bake together during our first year of marriage. Your grandfather accidentally used salt instead of sugar, I said with a small laugh. It was absolutely terrible, but he insisted we eat every bite because we could not afford to waste ingredients. Lily giggled. Ethan smiled faintly. Then Brittany set down her fork. Margaret, she interrupted with a sigh, not tonight. The room fell quiet. She folded her hands neatly on the table. We have talked about this before. Your stories tend to dominate dinner conversations. She offered a tight smile that never reached her eyes. Maybe it would be better if you finished your meal upstairs. Everyone seems more relaxed that way. The words settled over the table like heavy fog. Lily's smile disappeared instantly. Ethan stared down at his plate. I looked at my son and waited. I gave him the same opportunity one had given him before. Seconds passed. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hallway. Finally, Ethan cleared his throat. Mom, he began carefully. Perhaps we should all avoid unnecessary tension. Unnecessary tension. I felt no embarrassment this time. No confusion. Only clarity. Slowly, I reached beside my chair and lifted the leather folder I had placed there before dinner. Brittany frowned. Ethan blinked in surprise. I rested the folder carefully on the table between the serving dishes and untouched rolls. Lily's eyes widened. I folded my hands neatly in front of me and met Brittany's gaze with a calmness I had not felt in years. No, I said softly. I do not think I will be eating upstairs tonight. The silence that followed was absolute. Then I looked at Ethan before speaking again. I think it is time we discuss the plans the two of you have been making for my future without my knowledge. Ethan stared at the folder resting between the dinner plates as though it had appeared by magic. Brittany recovered first. She leaned back in her chair and forced a small laugh that sounded brittle around the edges. Margaret, I think there has been some misunderstanding, she said smoothly. Everything we have discussed has only been out of concern for you. I met her gaze steadily. Concern does not usually happen in secret, I replied. Concern does not involve consultations and brochures left hidden beneath stacks of mail. Ethan's face drained of color. Mom, he began, finally looking directly at me. We were only trying to think ahead. You have been alone since Dad passed away. We thought maybe you would be happier somewhere with more people your age. I folded my hands together on the table Thomas and I had saved for months to purchase when Ethan was still in elementary school. Then why was I never included in the conversation? Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it again. Brittany stepped in quickly. Because these discussions are difficult. We did not want to upset you until we had explored all the options. Her voice remained calm, but I noticed the tension in her jaw and the way her fingers tightened around her water glass. Lily sat quietly beside us, her eyes moving from one face to another. I gently opened the folder and removed several documents. I visited Harold Benson today, I said. The effect was immediate. Brittany's expression faltered. Ethan blinked rapidly. Harold, he repeated. Dad's attorney? I nodded. Thomas made certain arrangements before he died. He understood that life changes. People change. Circumstances become complicated. He wanted to ensure that I would never lose my voice simply because I was grieving or growing older. I placed the papers carefully on the table without drama. I have no intention of discussing private legal details tonight. But I want both of you to understand something clearly. I am capable of making decisions about my own future. I am not a problem to solve quietly behind closed doors. I am not furniture that can be rearranged for convenience. Ethan lowered his head into his hands. Mom, I never wanted you to feel unwanted. The sadness in his voice pierced me far more deeply than Brittany's dismissiveness ever had. And yet, I said softly, you watched me carry my dinner upstairs because speaking up would have been uncomfortable. Silence settled. Over the room, Lily reached beneath the table and slipped her small hand into mine. Brittany looked away first. I suppose I underestimated how aware you were, she admitted quietly. I considered her words before answering. No, you underestimated how long I would remain silent. The grandfather clock chimed in the hallway. The roast cooled on serving dishes no one had touched for several minutes. Outside, the evening sky deepened into shades of blue and gold. I looked around the table and saw not villains and victims, but people standing at the crossroads of their choices. I am not leaving this house because someone decided my presence was inconvenient, I said. If I ever choose a different chapter for my life, it will be my decision. Until then, I expect honesty, respect, and a place at this table. Ethan's eyes filled with regret. I am sorry, Mom, he whispered. Lily squeezed my hand tighter. Even Brittany's carefully constructed composure softened into something quieter and more uncertain. I thought of Thomas's note resting upstairs on my nightstand. Never allow loneliness to convince you that respect is something you must beg for. For too long, I had mistaken peace for silence and love for endurance. But family was never meant to require disappearing pieces of yourself to make others comfortable. That night, I remained in my chair until dessert was served. I shared stories about Thomas teaching Ethan to ride a bicycle and listened to Lily describe her dreams of becoming a veterinarian. No one asked me to leave. No one suggested another room. And as laughter slowly returned to the table, I realized that the strongest thing I had done was not uncover hidden plans or consult an attorney. It was remembering that age had not diminished my worth, grief had not erased my voice, and love without respect was never something I needed to accept.